Hi, thank you so much, Leah. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm very excited to be talking about storytelling, which is a big part of my career, and talking about specifically how we all have stories that we can share and how we can make them really powerful to drive change in our communities. So thank you all for the work that you do in your communities and for joining today and working on, how to be more effective advocates. I'm going to share my screen. One moment. All right, can you see my screen, hopefully? Yes, looks like that. Okay, great. So just getting myself organized on my computers here. All right, so basically, I'm at Elevate now. Elevate is a public affairs firm with offices in Los Angeles and Sacramento, and we help our clients tell stories that shape public perception and move the needle on lots of different kinds of policy issues. So right now, we have dozens of clients, but we're working with clients on issues ranging from mental health funding to AI rules to clean energy adoption, to food affordability, just to name a few of the projects that I'm working on right now. HLI, I was an HLI class of 2017, and I'm so proud to be associated with this network and grateful for the network because it has been very powerful in my life and in my career. I think, with HLI, I knew about it for years. I had thought about applying for years, but not until after the election of 2016 did I really decide. Like one night I was up at 3 a.m. and I just like rage applied to HLI, and was so happy that that worked out because I really needed a place to funnel that energy. And I think it really helped me up level the work that I can do in my community and in my career. And, also, as we all know, there's that sisterhood aspect. I have some really great friends that I made from HLI, including my best friend, who I met. She was my first roommate at HLI, and we became friends basically because, I mean, one, like she's funny and we have a lot, and smart, we have a lot in common. But honestly, it's because like I walked into that hotel room that first night and she was wearing like some very silly pajamas, and we were talking very excitedly, and then she just like farted, and I was like, okay, I guess we're gonna be best friends. um, so we are really good friends, and I actually moved to Orange County a couple years ago, like partly because she lives here and that was easier and more convenient for our lives. I also met my husband that year, not through Hope, but I remember specifically that we had just started talking and I was at Hope in DC at a Hope event. And I had told him like, oh, I'm going to this thing. And so I won't be able to meet up with you until afterwards. And we were texting from DC, and I was showing all my Hope sisters at the bar, like his photo. And we were all, being very cute about that. And ended up getting married the next year. So 2017 was a big one for me. And Hope was a big part of that.
I love that. Thank you.
So storytelling and the aspect or how it can be really effective um, for advocacy. So Steve Jobs quote here, the most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. And I think coming from someone who had such a big effect, positive and negative, on the world, knowing that they think that storytelling is that powerful, I think really is indicative of how much we all have that power within us if we can harness it. So today we're going to cover the psychology of storytelling. We are going to talk about some real world examples of how stories have affected public policy. And then we will do a little exercise about crafting your narrative. So I think the thing that's really important around storytelling and the power that it has for advocacy is really thinking about feelings. So the reason why stories are so powerful, and we'll get into the science in a second, but just like stepping back, is it really comes down to this quote from Maya Angelou. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And this is applicable in, interactions that we have with our family members, with our coworkers, when, public forums. This is always true. And so, you can add to this too. People will forget the data that you brought. People will forget the picture of the renderings of the new building you're trying to build. But people will not forget how they felt when they had that meeting with you. So let's talk about some science for a minute. So the psychology of storytelling. Why is a story so powerful? It's because when you're telling a story, you are using, or hearing a story, you are using multiple parts of your brain. So when you're hearing a list of facts or you're hearing, looking at numbers or something, that you are using there's one part of your brain that lights up during in that kind of simple conversation. But when you're talking engaged in a storytelling, if that story has textures or smells or sights that are being described, excuse me, then your sensory cortex is being lit up as well. If that story includes movement, then your motor cortex is being um, triggered or whatever. If the story makes you feel something, then your amygdala, which I don't know what an amygdala is honestly, or like where it is or whatever, but I just love saying the word amygdala. When that is an emotion center apparently of your brain, and that part lights up too. So when all of these different parts of your brain are engaged, the story is more immersive and becomes more memorable. And this is why, honestly, like we love chisme, right? When we are hearing gossip, it lights up multiple parts of our brains. The other part of that is when we're hearing gossip or hearing a story, it triggers this thing called mirroring. So we have mirror neurons in our brains, which fire when it really like helps us to feel what the characters are feeling, and we naturally empathize with people whose experiences that we can picture. Um, Another thing about stories and why it matters in our brains is that humans are naturally pattern-seeking creatures. So we crave meaning, and stories help people connect emotionally before they analyze logically. Stories are also easier to remember. So that's really important when we're talking about policy and making your story elevate above the noise. I mean, I told a little bit of a story earlier about my experience with HLI, and I talked about some silly things and some personal things and some emotional things. Those are the things that probably like were engaging in some way, and you might remember after this, even when you forget about what the amygdala does. So I'd love to take a minute, and can you think of a story that you heard this week that stuck with you in some way? And think about the feeling when you think about the story and the feeling that it evokes for you. So was it a story that made you sad? Was it a story that made you happy? Was it a story that made you frustrated or mad, confused, worried? Like all of those are feelings that we probably feel when we're reading the news or hearing about something going on with a family member or whatever. So think of a story, and why don't you put in the chat the feeling that comes to you when you're thinking of that story? Now I have to find my chat screen. Okay, there's that. And if you want to say like a little, like one sentence about what the story was, then that's cool, but no pressure also. Concern. Yes, I feel so much concern so much of the time these days. Worry, stress. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Because, okay, so all of you guys are talking about the news, I think. Inspired. Yeah, Rebecca, way to go. Please share whatever that story was in the chat so we can all feel a little more inspired and a little less stressed, worried, anxious, I think is a word I hear a lot. Um, and I'll just share an example of today. So I get the LA Times alerts on my phone, which is probably a terrible idea, and I should really stop because why? But the alert that I saw this morning was about a dozen day laborers who were picked up by ICE outside of a Home Depot today. And the feeling I felt was like dread. You know, I that like that's an example where I can really empathize with the people that are being spoken about in that story. I can think about like their families. I'm thinking about here's 12 guys. They go out every day probably to, wherever, like to that Home Depot parking lot or whatever. And they don't know, like, especially over the last few months, they're probably thinking, I don't know if I'm going to come home today. I don't know, like, there's all of these feelings from that one sentence story, really. Because I haven't had time this morning yet to even read the article, so I don't even know the details. But that's where the brain goes, right? A lot of parts of my brain are being lit up from just that one little alert. So that's just an example, but again, sorry to make like a sad, stressful one. I should have more inspired stories ready to go. Um, okay. Wait, now I've lost my things. All right. So,
You shared
oh,
a positive story.
oh, good, Rebecca. Thank you for sharing a positive story about volunteering in Southgate. Wow, that's great. And like this school got a really impactful grant. So that's probably a public policy win. Somewhere 12 years ago, they told some stories about that school and why they should get that money and look at the impact that it's made 13 years later. So that's awesome. Thank you, Rebecca. Oh, one other thing I think I forgot to mention was this feelings drive thing. So emotion drives action more reliably than logic alone, and we can see that so clearly in so many policies that we and so much as that's going on right now. So one example, so here's an example, a real world example of a story that here we go, is related to the fires that happened, right? So the fires that happened here in LA back in January, it was a huge story for months. And there were so many individual stories that come out of that. When we're talking about reporters or policymakers, we're talking about communities, because we're making policy that affects at the community level. But what really impacts them is also hearing about individuals. So here's a story about day laborers working to help clean up around the Eaton fire. This was on January 10th. Sorry, I don't have the headline there. Then January 14th, this story came out. I think there had been a narrative when the fires happened that most people who were affected were very wealthy residents of Palisades. But after a few days, it started to become clear that there was a much bigger economic and community impact for people who worked in the Palisades community. So housekeepers, gardeners, all that, like all nannies, all that sort of thing. And so it really helped people like zoom out as to what the bigger impact was going on there. So a few of these stories came out, and then before the end of the month, LA officials were starting to give cash aid to service workers who were hit hard by these fires. So specifically, they had set aside money for workers whose income was affected because their place of work had been burned down. Even if it wasn't their home or their child's school, it was recognition that different communities had been affected in really challenging ways. And so a policy outcome happened really fast in this particular scenario. Um, Things to keep in mind here are that the emotion of that moment was already really heightened, right? It was a very dramatic time for a lot of people across a big part of a huge city. And so people and journalists and elected officials are really like focused on that and hungry for stories. I know that myself, I was refreshing my LA Times app all the time. I was looking at LAist. They were doing a lot of cool, interesting stories at the time. And that goes back to what we saw on the previous slide about people being hungry for meaning making and stories helping us organize organize our thoughts in chaos and chaotic moments. And so, I know like I was doing that a lot. And the reporters that we were talking to during that time, they really wanted to talk to a specific person. So I was with a client who was doing like a big event, like a supplies giveaway for people who had been affected by the fire. And the reporters were interested, kind of, but what they really wanted to know was, can they talk to somebody who was gathering supplies who had been affected? So they really want that personal, individual story. And that's the power that or sharing that or finding someone who's willing to share that story brings attention to the broader resources that were available in the community at that event. Um, And then there have another example here. I don't know if any of you read this article, or this was an essay really from Jessica Salgado, who is a poet here in Los Angeles. And she, again, like wrote a very evocative, tender piece about in the LA Times about the childhood memories that she had from the Palisades because her mother worked as a nanny and a housekeeper for a few different families in the Palisades. And so she talks about how she was feeling seeing that community be so affected. She found out that the houses that her mother had cleaned and had worked in, and that Jessica had herself had spent time when they would, dog sit when the family went out of town. And that picture is of Jessica and her sisters in a pool, a swimming pool. And there's one, you can't see it as well, but it's her on a tennis court. So she was like, I'm a girl from East LA. When am I ever going to have like a private tennis court and a swimming pool? But I had the opportunity to enjoy these places that my mother took so much pride in because she like kept them clean and kept them beautiful. And to know that those houses like don't exist anymore and like what that meant to her. It was a very powerful example of this larger narrative that was starting to come out a little bit, a couple weeks after the fires. So what makes a story work for advocacy? I would say one, again, emotional, right? Like people will forget so many things, but they won't forget how they felt with that story. And even if it's hard for me to describe how I felt reading the story, that like the essay, for example, that Jessica wrote, um, it's I can't tell you, I'm not sitting here telling you the story, telling you about that essay and how I felt at the time. But the fact that I had strong feelings by reading it helps me remember the details that I just shared with you right then, right? It helps me remember and think about the broader community that her story represents. And so it's a personal story to her, but it was easy to understand, easy to repeat. That's an important part of what we're talking about for advocacy. It illustrates a larger point. It's not just about Jessica and her family and her mother and the house that she worked in. It's about all the people like her that have a similar example or have a similar story and feeling. And then also, normally I say that when you're talking about storytelling for advocacy, you want to have data to back it up, right? So if we're talking about, a story I read recently was about certain communities where they have a lot of truck traffic and the air quality problems there and the higher prevalences of asthma in those communities, right? So they were looking for a policy outcome. And that story um, if you're looking for a policy outcome and you have a proposed solution, having data about what's the percentage of kids in that community that have asthma and how much more does it cost to treat those kids because they're low income in an emergency room type setting than it would be if if they had better access to healthcare and if we could, change the fuels that those trucks were using to cleaner fuels, how much would an impact would that have, right? So it's telling a story with data, but the article really focused on a kid named David and how he loved to play soccer with his cousins and how, talked about a specific night where he had a really bad asthma attack and had to go to the emergency room, right? So it's telling you about, like, I don't remember the percentage of kids in his neighborhood who had asthma. I don't remember, what's the bill number that they were advocating for, but I remember David, I remember soccer. And so it's all of these pieces that come together. Now, normally I would say these last 2 points are really important, but I will also just point out that you don't always need those things. If you're telling a story that's emotional, personal, easy to understand, easy to repeat, that can be powerful too. And we see that in our political situation right now. Here's a story that was told over and over again, even though it wasn't even true. And yet we see how it affects public perception. It affected a particular election. It is affecting the way that immigration policy is being handled now. And so this story about, they're eating the dogs and eating the cats, it's emotional, right? Because if you hear somebody saying that, you might have a dog or a cat, and then you're sad about that. You also are maybe feel disgust. That's a feeling because most people are not eating dogs and cats, and that's for some reason like cows and pigs are okay to eat and dogs and cats are not, but I'm mostly vegetarian, so that's a different discussion. So you might feel disgust, you might feel like personally like worried about your own animals. Animals are cute, whatever. So even though this didn't personally happen to you, this person telling the story, it didn't happen to him either, but he made it very personal for people. It's easy to understand and easy to repeat because clearly they made a lot of memes about it, right? They're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. Um, and it illustrates a larger point. This person's point is that immigrants are not to be trusted. They're not like us. They don't share our same values. They're gross, and they will come and take what's precious to you and use it for their own needs. That's the larger point that this person is trying to make, right? So no data, no, but they do have a proposed solution actually, which is build the wall. Again, easy to understand, easy to repeat, and it doesn't even necessarily mean build a wall like a physical wall, because in this example they were talking about Haitian immigrants, in which case a wall would not necessarily, I mean, only have some impact. But it is an easy emotional solution, quote unquote, right? So again, sorry to be negative. I'm in a weird headspace right now, guys. And but these things do illustrate how storytelling can be very powerful in our policy and advocacy work. Okay, so now we are going to do a little exercise, and we're going to do a first draft of your authentic story. So we're going to take 3 minutes to think about a problem that you're trying to solve in your community. Um, think about, why is this important to you? So why is this important to you? And how is it personal to you? And again, like personal doesn't mean that like if you're trying to fix something at your kid's school, your park, it doesn't mean like, it could be because your kid goes there. Or maybe you're talking about education policy, but you don't even have kids. And so it's like, well, why is it personal to, it's still personal to you in some way if you're passionate about it. So think about, why is it important to you? How is it personal to you? And what is your vision for how things could be different? So we're going to take 3 minutes. You're not going to, that's not a lot of time. So this is a very rough draft and could be bullet points. It's really more of a brainstorm. After the 3 minutes, then we're going to split you out into pairs, and you guys are going to share your stories, just like your raw stories. Then we're going to come back and talk about how to polish those up for advocacy. So 3 minutes starting now. Thank you.
Right.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hopefully you made a friend. And we're not gonna do sharing out at this time, so don't worry about that. But just as a reminder, what we have on our screen here is the issue that you're trying to solve. Why is this important to you? How is it personal to you? And what is your vision for how things could be different? So hopefully you've got, at least kind of the basic message out there about where, about those few points. And now we're going to take that as like considering that kind of like your brainstorm, your first draft. Now we're going to talk about how to craft that for a narrative for advocacy. So here's some things to consider as you're taking kind of your raw story and crafting it into a narrative. One is that your audience is the context. So you need to meet them where they're at and what will they connect with most. I don't know if you can see this. This is the coconut tree meme. Um, but that people have their own context. And so you have to think about, are you telling the story when you're doing a lobby day, like Latina Action Day, and you're up in Sacramento and you're meeting with staffers in their offices? Are you telling this story to a journalist and they're gonna publish a story about it? Are you telling the story on your own social media account to the people that follow you? Like, who is the audience? What is going to resonate with them the most? And even things like, where are they? Like if you're trying to do kind of a voter outreach campaign, for example, like where are those voters getting their news? Where are they? Are there ads that you can buy to get in front of them on social media or in print or in their communities? What language do they speak? Should you do it in English? Should you do it in Spanish? Should you do it in Tagalog? Like there's so many things to keep in mind when you're talking about meeting your audience where they're at. Another thing is focus your key message. So, like I said before, it should be memorable, easy to remember, and easy to repeat. So, focus on your key message. What is the most important point that you want to get across, and try to simplify the story a little bit. You still want there to be details that help fire up those different parts of the brain, right? Colors, textures, things that make you feel, but try to simplify the story. You want to make an emotional connection. And here, I really encourage people to be vulnerable and be specific. If you're talking about, like something that's going on in your community and why is it important to you, the more vulnerable you can allow yourself to be, which is really hard for a lot of people, the more emotional resonance that story will have. And then back it up with data and pictures. So a lot of times, when you're telling a story, you're telling your personal story, but if you're doing a lobby day, for example, you might have a one-pager that talks about a particular bill that you're supporting and some data that talks about why that bill is going to be like a winning solution for the problem. And a call to action. So connect the emotion to the solution. So now we're going to break out again for another 5. This time we'll do it for 10 minutes, I think. We have time, right? Yeah, that gets us good time. So we're going to break out for 10 minutes with those same partners. Oh, wait, can you do that, Leah?
Let me try.
I think, oh, sorry, I should have told you that before.
It might change actually, just because we have new folks that just joined us.
Okay, got it. All right, so you're gonna get together with your partners, may or may not be the same ones, and think about these pieces of advice, to think about how to get move your story, your personal story, and that kind of like raw first draft, and think about how to craft it for an advocacy objective. So we'll break out for 10 minutes. I have a pop-up on my screen that says open all rooms, so it looks like there's still some people in room. Should I press that button?
Yeah, go ahead.
Everyone should be back.
Oh, it was in close all rooms. Now it says close all rooms. Oh yeah, it looks like people, okay, I see. It looks like those people aren't in those rooms. Okay, so we're back. Great. How was that? Anybody want to share something that you learned, an interesting fact, something you thought was like super effective that somebody came up with? Feeling shy? My coconut tree meme isn't hitting you?
I don't mind sharing. I love sharing. Hi everyone, my name is
Ellie?
Lee.
Okay, go ahead, Araceli. Thanks.
I wrote about climate change is my biggest thing that I'm fighting for right now. And with I haven't wrote anything in the past about it, but I've always had it on my conscience. And you help me brainstorm and get all this stuff on paper right now. I'm fighting climate change is important to me because I, as a child, have experienced water scarcity when I was living in Mexico. And I deeply care about Mother Earth and all the living animals and humanity. And it's personal to me because as a mechanical engineer, I have attended many engineering conferences, and these conferences explain how we're living in desperate times. And if we don't act soon, we won't have a Mother Earth. My vision for things would be like, I hope people can plant more trees and more people can volunteer to act on different organizations that are supporting climate change. And because it's a time, there's so many problems in this world today that are very desperate in need. But if we don't start separating and stop fighting and separating our differences and start uniting, we won't have a Mother Earth, and it's time to address climate change for the sake of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Araceli. Thanks for sharing that. And I guess I have some thoughts about like what stuck out to me about that story, what I thought was really effective, but does anybody else want to jump in and like to say like what really resonated you? What's the most memorable thing from what Araceli said?
Liz, this is Denise. I just wanted to say, Araceli, I really appreciated you participating, but I will say when you mentioned having experienced water scarcity, that resonated with me. So I think the vulnerability really was really impactful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you want to say also something? And Denise Juarez, I see, has a hand raised.
Thank you. I just wanted to share, first of all, Araceli did an amazing job. I think that what was really impactful for me, it was hearing how we're affecting the upcoming generations. I think that that specific part motivates you to reflect on the problem that we are facing and also motivates you to take action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me, I agree with Denise, or the first Denise. I guess that was two Denises in a row. That the part that really stuck out and was most memorable to me and was like interesting and I wanted to hear more about was your personal experience with water scarcity. And I think that the second Denise mentioned like that you connected that to a broader story about like it's kind of thinking about you as a child, but you're now in a position where you're thinking about future generations and connecting that, and the policy piece there I think is really powerful. One thing I'll just note is that your personal experience is the thing that why I think that's what sticks out a lot of times for people is because, talking about Mother Earth, talking about, how we owe it to the future generations, how, we're like, and, issues around climate change, like a lot of people talk about that. But not a lot of people talk about this is what it felt like when I didn't have enough water. And like, this is what the infrastructure was like at the house that I lived in. And, I think about climate refugees that are happening now and will happen in the future. And like, they could experience that and how scary that is for a kid. Like those are the things, and I don't mean to be putting words in your mouth. I'm extrapolating here, but like, I think that like when you're crafting your narrative, really thinking about that. I'm just noticing the time now, we're a minute over. And so I just want to thank Araceli for sharing and the two Denises for weighing in as well. And for all of you for participating today. I'll stay on in case anyone has questions or wants to chat, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you so much and good luck with all of your endeavors out there telling your stories for your advocacy work.